Okay, I think we'll get started. It's about 5 minutes past the hour, and we have a fairly large number of participants here already. Welcome to the first meeting of the Fairbanks Center's Modern China Lecture Series. My name is Arunabh Ghosh. I teach Modern Chinese History here in the History Department at Harvard. Before I introduce our speaker today, I thought I'd give you a quick heads up on some of the talks and speakers we have forthcoming, so you can mark your calendars and sort of make sure you can join us. 3 weeks from now, on October 13th, also Tuesday at 4 p.m., we'll welcome Gina and Tam from Trinity University. A couple of weeks after that, on October 27th, we'll have Fei Xian Wang from Indiana University, Bloomington. On November 10th, we will welcome Covell Meiskens from the Naval Postgraduate School. If you're interested in any of our future events, please mark your calendars, and please do join us then too. Formal announcements will follow in the coming weeks, including instructions on how to register and so on. So that's just a heads up of our future talks. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sören Urbansky, who will be talking about his work on the history of the Sino-Russian border. Sören is a historian of Russia and China in the modern era, specializing in imperial and racial entanglements, emigration, and the history of borders. He is currently a research fellow at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, he taught Chinese and Russian history at the universities of Munich and Freiburg, and he has also been a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge. Sören received his PhD from the University of Konstanz in 2014, and he has also studied at the European University, Viadrina, and at Tsinghua University in Beijing. Among his publications are Kolonialer Weltstreit, Russland, China, Japan, und die Ostchinesische Eisenbahn, which is on the history of the railroads in the Sino-Russian border, and much more recently, of course, Beyond the Steppe Frontier, a history of the Sino-Russian border. Sören is currently embarking on a new project that examines anti-Chinese sentiments in a global perspective, a topic that has taken on increasing importance, as you can well imagine. Before I hand things over to him, just a quick word on format. In light of being completely online, we figured that maybe a regular 45-50-minute talk is perhaps pushing the limits of people's attention spans. So I've requested Sören to speak for a slightly shorter duration, about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A for roughly the same duration. So we'll plan to be done by about 5:15, 5:20, thereabouts. If you have questions, please type them up in the Q&A using the Q&A function. Before you type up your question, please identify yourself, because I will try and I will be reading them out, so it'll be nice to be able to identify who's asking them. That being said, this is being recorded, and we understand that there might be people who won't be comfortable in identifying themselves. If that's the case, you're of course welcome to stay anonymous. That is not a problem at all. Okay, so without further ado, over to Dr. Urbansky.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Ghosh, for this kind introduction, and thank you for being invited to speak at the Modern China Lecture Series at Harvard University. Let me just share my screen with you. All right. In my book, Beyond the Steppe Frontier, I examine the formation of what was once the longest land border in the world. In addition to its vastness, the Sino-Russian border was special in many ways. It not only divided the two largest Eurasian empires, it was also the place where European and Asian civilizations met, where nomads and sedentary people mingled, where the imperial interests of Russia and later the Soviet Union clashed with those of Qing and Republican China and Japan, and when the world's two largest communist regimes hailed their friendship and staged their enmity. During its existence, the Sino-Russian border has taken fundamentally different forms, which make it at one point comparable to colonial borders in Africa, and just decades later to the borders between nation states in Cold War Europe. I study this remarkable transformation of the Sino-Russian border with a regional focus on the rolling steppe of the Argun River region, near to today's eastern Sino-Russian Mongolian border triangle. The grassy prairie on both riverbanks is perhaps the most suitable border section on which to focus. It constitutes the oldest border segment between the powers to survive subsequent territorial changes. Moreover, the area represents two different sorts of borders. As a water body, the Argun was generally open. People easily navigated the river in boats to transport people, livestock, and goods. Only a short ride away, however, the railroad town of Manjuli, housing customs inspectors and migrant workers, represented a very different social fabric and along with it, a new form of border. Before we discuss the details of the formation of this border during the next half hour, allow me to introduce to you Arkady Yanechik. Arkady was from Borza, a small Soviet town less than 2 hours by train from the Chinese border. Secret police investigators raided Arkady's house on June 17th in 1931. Neither then 46-year-old Arkady nor his wife or their children were at home. Instead, officers encountered 4 Chinese men at the kitchen table. During their search of the house, inspectors found various gold articles, dresses, white silk, and plenty of tea. The inspectors accused Arkady of illicitly importing foreign fabrics and tea from the Chinese border city of Manjuli, destined for Russian consumers. It was also alleged that he would purchase gold items in the Soviet Union to sell them illegally abroad, that is in China. The Borza citizen Van Lichen acted as prosecution witness. Li Chen, a Chinese national married to a Russian woman, had recently observed how some Chinese took clothes stored at Arkady's house in Borza to transport them to a nearby mine where they exchanged the fabrics for gold and silver. Arkady had many Chinese friends because he was no ordinary Soviet citizen. Born in 1885 in the region, he had worked from 1907 till 1928 with the Russian and later with the Soviet customs at different places and in various positions. His longest post was at the customs office in Manjuli, where he had served for 9 years. This was plenty of time to make friends with the Chinese residents in town, as Arkady admitted. He spoke Chinese well and was acquainted with Chinese culture. His job as duties inspector exposed him to Chinese people every day, bestowing upon him a strategic competence that he could use for the benefit of his illicit business. The case of Arkady reveals close contacts between the Chinese and the Russians. One could almost forget that in 1929, that is 1 year before the police raided Arkady's house, China and the Soviet Union were at war, with Manjuli as the main battlefield. The social fabric of the sleepy railroad town of Borza, about 70 miles off the border with China, reveals that around 1930, the border had by no means been hermetically sealed. Numerous Chinese nationals like Van Lichen still lived and worked in the Soviet border region. Russians likewise continued to live in the Chinese borderland. Through the autobiographical lens of Russian, Chinese, and indigenous people and visiting foreigners and the stories they have to tell, I challenge the great picture of diplomatic histories and top-down interpretations of the Chinese-Russian frontier and the Chinese-Soviet borderland. Listening to the voices of the nomadic herdsmen, merchants, and border guards, acknowledging them as historical actors and juxtaposing their narratives with the stories of the metropolitan elites makes evident that the fate of the imperial frontiers and borderlands was never solely decided in the metropoles. The networks, strategies, and social identities of these border people map complicated patterns that stretched across the border. Cossacks, for instance, sought self-determination, became outlaws, or emigrated. Arkady and other customs officials, be they Russian or Soviet, Russian or Chinese, worked as part-time traders, selling commodities confiscated from smugglers in contraband bazaars. Native nomadic herders responded to metropolitan incursions by practicing cross-border migration or strategic naturalization. Although China and Russia sketched the oldest section of their boundary over 300 years ago, the executive bodies did not efficiently control flows of people and commodities on their shared frontier. In many ways, their border remained an open inter-imperial frontier where social and cultural identities of peoples of different ethnic and linguistic roots merged and shifted. Most parts of this imperial frontier space thus remain porous, with people and commodities continuing to flow freely. Abilities to construct, strengthen, and maintain international boundaries grew over time, partly because of advancement in technology and organization, but also because growing investments allowed resources to control even the remotest peripheries. By introducing modern infrastructure, states authorized a particular form of border crossing, and in doing so, accelerated formal border making. Such infrastructure projects were built to facilitate the flow of goods, people, and ideas through the borderland corridor in a manner suited to their political creators. The metropoles would succeed in tightening their control over the entire borderland significantly in the 1930s, roughly by the time Arkady operated his sophisticated contraband network from his kitchen table. The metropoles did so by applying more severe penalties to border transgression and by installing much stronger military presence on state perimeters. No longer was just the external state boundary monitored. The borderland had become isolated from the inside and the outside, with border zones in which communities and their members were subject to special supervision and individuals' movement into them restricted. With the international border firmly sealed, the Soviet Party state and the Manchukuo and later PRC governments deported or killed locals holding ties across the perimeter. Reliable citizens gradually replaced allegedly disloyal people, even if definitions of the category reliable constantly shifted. Traditional life patterns, if they continued to exist, became encapsulated in the new national cultures. Military hostilities also reshaped the border as a metaphorical sphere now displayed as a bulwark against the enemy neighbors in the propaganda on both sides of the river. During the post-war years, despite being marked by increasingly omnipresent friendship rhetoric and bilateral cooperation, border connections evolved as policies no longer established informally but strictly overseen by Moscow and Beijing. Thus, the international cross-border economy and the organized friendship delegation visits to accompany them no longer resembled historically unregulated exchange within the traditional borderland society. Stricter control of flows of people was, however, just one reason for this shift into formality. Many of the new settlers had never crossed the border in their lives. Their lack of language skills and ignorance of the other culture generated indifference towards their new neighbors. The Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s and the 1970s resulted in a new arms race at the border, supplemented by more weaponry and soldiers than had even been assembled during the Manchukuo-Soviet confrontation of the 1930s and 1940s. Transit cargo declined sharply as a result, and Beijing-Moscow trains were no longer filled with Soviet or Chinese citizens. The Manjuli-Zabaykalsk checkpoint was in fact for some time the only railroad crossing open to travel between China and the Soviet Union. During the split, with only a few hundred passengers crossing the border every week, the overall number of travelers had been very low, even at this very last point of passage. The most striking finding to be gleaned from passenger statistics of that period is the decline in Chinese and Soviet nationals from the trains. In 1966, Chinese travelers still constituted the absolute majority. In 1969, however, only 2 Chinese passengers crossed the border by train out of nearly 7,000 passengers in total. Figures for Soviet passengers are similar. During the 1970s, the overwhelming majority of passengers originated from the socialist sister states Vietnam and North Korea. Being close allies of Moscow, both countries sent students and business delegations to the Soviet Union, as long as Beijing allowed their transit through Chinese territory. The traffic statistics thus reflect political relations in East Asia and beyond. They give an account of a highly regulated border that could not be crossed easily by ordinary tourists, world travelers, or even locals. The rift had a lasting influence on more than just the passengers on the international trains. It had dire consequences for the economy and demography of the borderland. In addition, propaganda campaigns revived old motives of infiltration, sabotage, espionage, and disinformation, imbibing the border with new legitimacy as a space of enmity. Yet, with the border now closed for decades and a population no longer familiar with its neighbor, such messages were arguably more effective than ever before. To get a better idea of how isolated the Soviet citizens had become over time from their Chinese neighbors, we can take a look at local newspapers. From 1970 on, China was to appear in the Soviet local press only sporadically, when Moscow anticipated new acts of aggression along the border emanating from Beijing or became aware of new anti-Soviet sentiment in China. Apart from reports on Chinese politics in the state media, Soviet border dwellers learned surprisingly little about China during the period of conflict. Until the late 1950s, however, when official relations between Beijing and Moscow had still been cordial, the case had been quite different. Local papers would, for instance, discuss seemingly amicable joint working life of Soviet and Chinese duty officers at the border stations of Zabaykalsk and Manjuli. The wording, even then, would have sounded stereotypical and crude, yet the descriptions in the story were astonishingly specific and vivid. The people in it had names, as did the places on both sides of the border. The reader might actually know the places and perhaps even some of the people. But an article from 1959 was to be the last such report to make explicit mention of dealings between Soviet and Chinese in the borderland, and in fact would be the final article to name Manjuli for a long time. Though Zabaykalsk and Manjuli lay just 6 miles apart, and one could gaze at the other across the border from the peaks of the steppe hills, the Soviet regional press refrained from mentioning Manjuli and other places in the Chinese border region for the next 26 years. At the beginning of my talk, we have already met Arkady and his Chinese friends. Allow me now to introduce yet another local border resident, the Shunter Vera Zolotaryova. Vera was born in 1938 in Sverdlovsk region, near the Ural Mountains, thousands of miles away from the border with China. In 1955, right after her graduation from a railroad college, Vera arrived in Zabaykalsk to work at the train station. Like most of the new residents, she was still an unmarried teenager. In contrast to the majority of her co-workers, Vera belonged to a limited circle of people allowed to travel to China on duty, even during the Sino-Soviet split. Vera cleared goods and passenger trains to Manjuli. Her passages were tightly overseen and confined to her professional duties. Though she recalled having amiable workmates among the Chinese railroadmen, she never questioned the border regime imposed by the state. Recalling one such situation in 1967, she testified, quote, "Of course, there were still a few contacts. I was friends with one Chinese colleague, but for him it was dangerous to express such friendship because they mutually spied on each other during the Cultural Revolution." End of quote. Vera's encounters with her Chinese workmates stand in stark contrast to Arkady's closely knit cross-border networks. Also, the mobility of people like Vera marked a striking departure from the experience of earlier generations of borderland pioneers who could cross the border relatively freely, or at least still remembered those merry times when the border had not been an obstacle, but an opportunity. The experience of Vera and her peers of the 1950s and 60s was different. Vera had spent her childhood and teenage years in the Soviet heartland provinces, far away from the Chinese border. So did most Chinese residents who moved in great numbers to the borderland beginning in the 1950s. Because of tight border regulations in place, unlike Vera, most had never set a foot in the neighboring country, as the border remained essentially closed for locals, as did the border zones for ordinary citizens. Engine drivers and shunters like Vera did far more than clear goods and passenger trains. Sometimes they assumed delicate tasks made necessary by relations between Moscow and Beijing. Zabaikalsk's municipal party committee received instructions from and regularly reported to the Communist Party Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in Moscow on meetings between Soviet and Chinese railroad men. Let me conclude with two of these encounters. On May 1st, 1972, 12 Manjuli railroad men visited Zabaikalsk. The program included a reception at the station's hotel, the screening of a movie on the Great Patriotic War, and a lunch in the railroad club. The Chinese delegates proposed toasts for May Day, for solidarity, for the friendship between the Chinese and the Soviet people, and for the railroad men of Manchuria and Zabaikalsk. Together they sang the Internationale. During their brief visit, quote, not a single time did the Chinese guests bring up ideas of Maoism and Mao Zedong thought, end of quote. To the Central Committee in Moscow, this was probably the most important message of the report. Following a similar format, Soviet delegates paid a return visit to Manjuli in the next day to find, quote, a welcoming and friendly reception, end of quote. With the permission of the Chinese authorities, the guests also got the chance to visit Manjuli's Soviet War Memorial. Though more sporadic and smaller in scale, in form and in content, these meetings resembled the exchanges of delegations that had taken place under the alliance regime of the 1950s. In times of conflict, however, those meetings fulfilled government's desire to exercise goodwill diplomacy at the lowest level. Moreover, depending on the changing state of diplomatic relations, both sides occasionally rejected proposals for such visits. In 1975, the Communist Party leadership in Manjuli declined a request by Zabaikalsk's district party committee for a ceremonial laying of wreath for the fallen Soviet soldiers at Manjuli's memorial to mark the 30th anniversary of the so-called liberation of Manchuria from the Japanese. The decision was made in consultation with the central government in Beijing. Zabaikalsk's station master was then informed by the Chinese that the Chinese people did in fact honor Soviet men who had given their lives, with annual wreath-laying ceremonies at memorials and cemeteries. Yet, with the developments of large Soviet military forces, yet with the deployments of large Soviet military forces on the Chinese border, joint commemorations would be inappropriate. Vera and other railroad workers in Manjuli and Zabaikalsk composed almost the sum of all legal border crossers in the period of conflict. Sometimes these last border crossers were exposed to the risks of political turmoil. Sometimes, too, they assumed the roles of weather balloons. As these metaphorical balloons rose through the atmosphere, they gathered important data on behalf of the political leadership in Moscow and Beijing. Their visits were quite accurate ways of measuring conditions on the ground, given the difficult relationship between the two communist regimes. In most cases, however, shunters and engine drivers simply did their jobs. And in allowing them to do so, both governments acknowledged that the border would never be hermetically sealed. Beginning in the 1980s, the border between China and the Soviet Union gradually became permeable again, both through policies adopted by the central governments and local population strategies. A gradual rapprochement between Beijing and Moscow permitted cross-border contracts, at first formally, but soon afterwards informally as well. As a consequence of these changes, illicit border trade, cross-border migration, and many other trans-border activities were reborn. Yet, although there is now evidence of numerous new Sino-Russian networks active in the present, the border has not fully withered away. It continues to exist as an economic, political, cultural, and as you can see in this photograph, even as a symbolic line of division between China and Russia, with many barriers still visible on the ground and engraved in the minds of the borderlanders. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much. That was really fascinating and gave a really nice snapshot of the research you've been doing these past several years and of the book as well. So the floor is basically open. I'm going to try and sort of represent people as they type in their questions. Please use the Q&A function. We have one question already, but before we get to that, I thought I'd maybe abuse my privilege and ask a question itself. I was wondering, as I was reading the introduction to your book, and I've read some of the chapters earlier, it's sort of especially for the early modern era, the way in which you evoke the border and not just how porous it is, but how the idea itself is kind of strange, in as much as the community there has a certain kind of cohesion that is different from both the metropoles, in this case the Russian and the Russian Empire and the Qing Empire metropoles. You know, it was very evocative of thinking about sort of the mountain regions that Willem van Schendel talks about in Zomia as these spaces of essentially alternative kinds of economic and political action that is consciously trying to stay away from sort of these more sedentary central agrarian powers, centralized powers. And I was wondering, do you see that kind of resonance, or is that too much of a stretch? Or can we think of these, because they're geographically somewhat different. I mean, these are not upland areas like Zomia typically is. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering if you have reflections on that or not, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That's a great question. And I think there's certain similarities in the sense that this is really like a place isolated from or different from the surrounding areas. And what is most striking in this early period of the Sino-Russian frontier, which actually lasts well into the first decades of the 20th century in some areas, is that internal borders, that is, let's say, borders between different Cossack hosts or between different banner lines on the Chinese side, often mattered more to those people on the ground than the actual state border. You can see this by herding patterns of nomads, that is, they would graze their cattle on both sides of the border, not being interrupted by state authorities, or by Cossacks, for instance, doing their hay on the Chinese bank and being allowed so by local Mongol authorities, who then only gradually had been replaced by the Chinese authorities. So it really starts to become a matter of fact when both sides decide to actually place the customs border on the actual state border. I mean, obviously this was just a snapshot, and I focused on mostly on the latter half of the 20th century, but the book is more, it's also about the early 20th century and going further back to the 19th and so on. And what is really changing is in the year or around 1900, when Russia decides to open its customs border along the state border. Before that, actually, everything east of Lake Baikal had been a free trade zone. So actually, things produced in Russia and Russian Far East had to go to customs to go actually to the European part or to Siberia, as did Chinese commodities. So once they decided to set up this customs border, they started to man the border. They started to impose quarantine restrictions, like when there was a plague, for instance. And with this economic establishment of the border, more and more it became a matter of fact even to the local people. I don't know.
Great, thank you. So we have a bunch of questions that are now coming in. So let's just dive in and take the first one, which is from Kenneth Linden, who's a PhD candidate at Indiana University. He says, Thank you very much for your talk. I study the history of Mongolia and North Asian herding history, and I'm curious if you could elaborate a bit more on the role of local herders in the negotiation of the border that you have found in your research.
Mm-hmm. Well, I somewhat touched upon this in Arnav's question already, but what really, well, actually they, like local nomadic people, that is mostly Buryats, but also other and Mongol tribes living in that area that I'm concerned with, began to fight for their independence in the early 20th century. And you know, when the Qing dynasty collapsed and Republic in China was established, Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, became an independent and then Soviet-dependent state. But also, like other areas of Inner Mongolia or present-day Inner Mongolia, tried to achieve this independence, and they were actually helped by Russian authorities. So there is this one case I discuss in my book by a Mongol nobleman from Inner Mongolia who is actually fighting against Chinese farmers and also Japanese topographers who actually mapped this area for the Chinese authorities, and claiming this land and taking away from the herders. And Russian authorities thinking of making use of that person whose name is Tortogo, and he's being basically invited to Russia, and he's seeking asylum, is being granted asylum, and he's basically being parked by the Russians there in case an eruption or people rise, like the locals rise, uprising, sorry, couldn't find the word. There's a local uprising, so they can actually bring him in and use him as a political figure. In the end, he's not being used because there's other people becoming more influential in that region. But for instance, even the Chinese side of the Argun River is independent and recognized by Russia for a couple of years before it's being integrated into China or Republic in China again. So there's definitely play a role in that story.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. So the next question is from Xingyuan, and they're looking at a different geographical direction, I guess. They want to know, how would you compare this border crossing with the one at Sufenhe that goes to Vladivostok?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, when I started looking at choosing a region, because I mean, I also thought you could actually write a book about the entire border, but then it becomes very complicated if you really want to go to the, if you do want to do like a microhistory and look at individuals who lived at this border, especially subaltern spheres, people who usually didn't leave any traces in the archives. So I decided to just look for one section, and another suitable section obviously would be Sufenhe and Gradiekovo. The other side is called, on the Russian side, the other end point of this railroad that was constructed by Russia through Manchuria in the early 20th century. But it's different in the sense that the Russian territory became Russian only in the mid 19th century, when basically the Governor General of Eastern Siberia conquered this territory, and in the treaties of Aigun and Beijing, it was ceded to the Russian Empire. And apart from that, so the story would be shorter there, but apart from that, it's also a different ethnic pattern. You won't have nomads there. You would still have indigenous people there, but you would also have many more Chinese on the Russian side living there for quite a long period, long before this actually became Russian. So it would be a slightly different story, and it would essentially mean that other than the region I'm looking at, where actually the ethnically dominant groups of both empires, that is the Great Russians and the Han Chinese, come in really late. I mean, some Russian Cossacks come in by the 18th century, but still it's heavily dominated by indigenous people. This was a different story there, I would argue.
Great. Actually, before we go to the next question, I was wondering maybe if you could tell us a little bit more, also partly motivated by your answer, by the question, and then you answered the question. Provide a sense of sort of what the research process was like, and what kinds of sources were you able to draw upon. I presume some of the photographs you showed us you took yourself. So maybe even just sort of give us a sense of did you travel these areas to get a sense of the border itself today? I think that would be very interesting to try and understand, especially because you're doing sort of both sides. You're trying to give weight to both sides.
Yes. Yeah, great question. And yes, I spent quite some time on both sides of the border. I studied Chinese in Harbin, for instance, which is not right on the border there, but it's in Dongbei, so to speak. And I spent more than a year in the Russian Far East in the archives. I wish I could have spent the same time in Chinese archives as I was able to spend in Russian archives. I mean, even Russian archives are challenging, but they're, compared to Chinese archives, much more open. And also, it's not just the policy of open archives or closed archives or whatever the current policy of access to archives is in China. It's also about the preservation of documents and the level of bureaucratization at that border. So I would argue that even the documents I was able to see, bureaucracy on the Chinese side was at least until the 1950s, which was much thinner than on the Russian side. But the good thing about borders when you do border research is even if you just have a limited access to archives on one side, you get a lot of correspondence ending up in Russian archives from China. Or I went to National Archives here in College Park near DC, where you have US consular files. United States had a consulate in Harbin. Germany had a consulate in Harbin for some time. So you can also use these kind of archival documents. And as it came up maybe a bit in my talk, I used various other sources, including oral history. I did interviews with locals. I used newspapers, visual sources, ethnographic accounts, and so on and so forth. So it's actually, it's very tricky because there's even not many local histories like written by local Chinese historians or Russian historians, but there's lots of materials to actually dig deep. You just need to find time. And
so Singha has a follow-up comment / question on sources and materials. So I'll jump to that and then follow the sequence as we have it. Singha is asking, with regard to Russian primary sources, in the late 1990s, the Institute of Far Eastern Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences was publishing year-by-year accounts of relations during the 17th century. How is that project going? Is it still ongoing? Do you know?
Something was interrupted. Can you just repeat?
I'll read it. I'll read it again. Yeah. So the question is, with regard to Russian primary sources, in the late 1990s, the Institute of Far Eastern Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences was publishing year-by-year accounts of Russo-Chinese relations during the 17th century. How is that project going?
I'm not aware that this is continuing, this project, but there is being constantly published kind of digests of archival materials from Russian archives and from the Russian Far East by the Academy of Science, the branch in Vladivostok, for instance, on customs, different customs posts. And there is this huge collection of the history, or edited, like a series of edited volumes on the history of the Russian Far East from its beginnings, that is the mid-19th century, until the post-Soviet time, but not that I'm aware of this archival documents collection that this is being continued, but I'm not sure.
Great, thanks. So next question, and you get a nice pat on the back. It starts by saying, this is from Lyle Goldstein, a fascinating presentation, well done. To my understanding, 2 bridges have been completed over the Amur during 2019, which is an important milestone. Do you believe that economic development of frontier regions is accelerating dramatically? Do you have additional evidence?
Yes, I've also heard about those bridges, and they have been called half bridges for quite a long time because the Chinese started to build them quite a long time ago, but Russia was reluctant to finish them. And I mean, there has been, since the 1990s, since the border was almost overnight became open again, a very strong exchange, economic exchange. And you might even argue that to some degree, Chinese merchants saved the Russian, then already Russian Far East from starvation and from economic hardship when the Soviet economic system broke down overnight. That is, subsidies to transport, cargo transport stopped to exist, and products like food and everything else became very expensive all of a sudden. So since then, you had this period of wild inter-exchange where nothing much was regulated. You had wild bazaars again in Siberian and Far Eastern cities with Chinese traders. Then you had also Russians engaging in the shuttle trade. But these things became more regulated over time. And until 2014, and we are just talking now on local or regional border trade, not about the big economic projects like, let's say, the oil and gas deals between Beijing and Moscow, or timber, lumber production and export to China. Until 2014, China was really a place to go for local Russians, or for Russians in Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, and other cities along the border. But this really changed in 2014 with the war in Ukraine and the collapse of the ruble in comparison to other currencies, including the renminbi. So China became much more expensive as a market to buy from, or to use services like a hairdresser or repair your car. This was really very common at the time, that you would repair your car on going to China, for instance. But nowadays, it's actually the other way around. It's not that Chinese using Russian services so much as Chinese tourism to Russia has become very common these days. I was luckily in 2019, when before COVID, I was in Irkutsk and other places, and it was March, and it was quite filled with Chinese tourists. So not a major travel season, and you can also see it when you take a plane from Beijing to, let's say, Vladivostok. It's usually 80–90% Chinese in the plane, and just 20 or 10% Russians. So I'm not sure about the bridges, because bridges can also be, you have a Schlagbaum. You would say, call it, like, I don't know, in Russian, it's German and the Russian word. Basically, you can close this border as much as you can stop a hovercraft or a ferry from crossing a river. So I don't think that this will significantly increase local border traffic, but it's a good symbol that finally these bridges become open again, or these bridges are being finished, and travel is becoming more easy. Yeah.
Great. Well, and obviously we don't have to talk about that now, but I think what is implicit in what you're saying, I guess, is to ask then, how has COVID-19 affected a lot of this tourism, right? Much in the way in which we talk about it in Europe and other places. But hold off, I have a lot of other questions, so I think we should
Okay.
with them. So the next question is from Kaya Tersmet, who says, thank you for your talk and your research, Dr. Urbansky. Can you tell us anything about the Chinese and Russians, or Russian-Soviet notions of borders? Did these notions overlap? If so, what origins do they share? And if they didn't overlap, how were differences smoothed out?
Yeah. My understanding is that Chinese notions of borders have much longer been the notion of a zone rather than an exact or precise line. You can see this actually also with the Kowloon, or the Chinese border posts, that they were not necessarily placed on the border, but you had some different layers to them. This was different with on the Russian side from very, very early on, when the Russians started to erect Cossack settlements. That is mostly, it's not like nowadays that you have a guard tower, like a tower where soldiers would just look across with their binoculars, but it was more villages where people were living and having like cattle and doing agriculture to, like, for life. They were part-time guards, so to speak, or were guarding the border part-time. Those were really placed on along the border from the very first moment. And I would say that during the 20th century, Russia or the Soviet Union had quite a number of inventions that were later adapted first by Manchuria and then to some degree also by the People's Republic of China. For instance, as I mentioned in my talk briefly, the Soviet Union introduced in the late 1920s so-called border zones. That is a second, like a zone running along the border, which is to which access is restricted to ordinary citizens. So you need to either live in there or have a special permit. Even you are a Soviet citizen doesn't mean you can go there. I actually grew up on the Iron Curtain between Germany and Germany, and there was the same, yet this 30 kilometers or maybe 20 miles of no access, and actually where villages had been demolished, people were moved out, not everybody, but it was thinned out to some degree. And this also existed in the Soviet Union, starting from the late 1920s, and then a similar thing was adopted in Manchuria in the mid 1930s, and to some degree, you also have a border zone in China, even in the present time. That when you go to these, I didn't talk about them, but you still have Russian Cossacks living on the Chinese side. When you visit these areas, you have to register with the local police.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. The next question is from a grad student in the history department here at Harvard, Dong Yuting. She's asking, I wonder whether it is possible to know more about the residents of this border in the 1920s and 1930s. Are they Russian diaspora? How do the local residents influence the perception of the border on the Soviet side? And then she thanks you for a wonderful presentation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, I mean, talking about diaspora, obviously after the Russian Revolution, there was quite a significant exodus of Russians emigrating mostly to Europe, but also to China. And Harbin, the provincial capital of Heilongjiang province, which had been founded by Russian, by this railroad company, really became a huge, like a significant city for those people emigrating to the east. But there were also rural communities like the Cossacks who already before the Russian Revolution had kind of crossed the border regularly for their economic, for their agriculture enterprises. They would emigrate in significant numbers, especially during the collectivization of the late 1920s, when basically the Soviet government took the livestock from them. So they emigrated in great numbers, and these people, to some of them, I mean, they are now mixed because they have intermarried with Chinese, but the descendants of these people still live in those areas and have become actually a major tourist attraction for Chinese who are interested in to see Russia without having to cross the border. But how did they influence the perception of the border on the Soviet side? Well, the Russian emigres were seen as the enemies. Actually, if you look at Russian propaganda or Soviet propaganda from the 1920s and also from the 1930s, the main enemy in the booklets, in the newspapers, are not the Chinese or are not the Japanese. They become later the major enemy as of the early 1930s, but are the White Russians who crossed across so in their terminology, the reactionaries. They had to be fight. They had to be. They needed to be destroyed to make this border safe again.
That's very interesting. Yeah. The next question we have, which takes us in a different but very interesting direction, is from Concepcion Lagos, who says, "Hello, I'm asking from the Philippines. Can you talk a bit about gender and religious conversion during intermarriages? Would you say religious conversions are equally distributed among brides and grooms from across nationalities, or are some data skewed towards a certain gender converting to their partner's religion?"
Mm-hmm. Very interesting question as well. A very short answer. Almost when there was an intermarriage, it was mostly Russian women marrying a Chinese man, and the Chinese men becoming Russian Orthodox. That's really 90% of the cases, I would say.
Okay, thanks. Another question that we have is from Martin Fromm, who asks, did the hardening of the border have an impact on the environment in the region? That is, did evolving political relations shape ecological conditions in the area?
That's a very good question. I would say yes to some degree, as is again with the German border, which is now in like a national, not really a national park, but it has become an ecological zone because it had been preserved so well. There was no agriculture, no industry. So nowadays you can cycle along it. You can cycle along the border between China and Russia nowadays, but I would say it has not been it has not been as developed as it would have been developed if it were not the state border. And there were actually problems with that because since many parts had not been developed intensively, so to speak, there were a lot of forest fires, for instance, more in northern parts, and there were attempts by Chinese and Soviet authorities still during the period of friendship to fight those fires with common or with kind of cooperation, like the fire planes, Soviet fire planes would help extinguish Chinese forest fires, so to speak. Yeah.
Just listening to your answer, I was also wondering, and then again in the book you talk about how extreme the climatic conditions are. You know, partly the terrain is interesting. You have some hills, and then you have the rivers are such an important conduit. But you talk about the extreme temperatures where in the summers it can go up to 35 degrees centigrade, I think you say, and in the winters it can be minus 30, 40, even colder. So the river freezes, and the river then becomes a different kind of it's not sort of you flow along the river, but you can just cross the river wherever you want in some ways. I was wondering, so in light of the more recent sort of climate-related concerns that we all have, and what we're seeing in California now with the forest fires, do you see that these kinds of things having a major impact on the on sort of economic, cultural, and environmental life in the region?
You mean the climate change?
Climate change, broadly speaking, because it's gonna affect these areas that have extreme weather patterns perhaps more.
Well, you have increasingly. I mean, you always had floods in that region, but you increasingly have floods over the. I think there was a big flood in 2013, and then again in 2019, and before that it was maybe every 20 years, and now it seems to become the intervals becoming shorter and shorter. And of course, floods create problems with that border. But what I would say, I mean, it's not a permafrost region like the north of Siberia, which is struggling a lot now, or it's not such it's not densely forested it has no thick forest, at least the region I'm talking about, because you have lots of forest fires as well in Siberia. So these areas are more affected by that. What I would say is a big problem, or was a big concern, even now that the relationship between China and the Russian Federation is a form of partnership, and in some degrees even an alliance. One may argue, is the ecological impact or environmental impact of industrialization in China. There was a huge spill of a chemical plant in Jilin province that affected the Songhua River and then also the Amur River. And this was a major issue for the local or regional population in the Russian Far East, since obviously also for the Chinese people living along those rivers, but it became an international problem once this dirty water basically entered the Russian territory.
Yeah. Great, thanks. The next question is from Tatiana Linkoeva, who says, congratulations, Sören, from me and Alvaro. My question, in your understanding, what was the role of the Japanese Empire's expansion into northern Manchuria in the changing nature of the Sino-Soviet border?
Well, that's a very good question. And I would say the major, the most decisive factor was really this militarization. The Soviet Union, although they had this conflict or even war in 1929 with the warlord Zhang about the control over this colonial railway, and the Soviet Union was never really concerned or afraid of an attack of this warlord on its borders. This changed with Japan occupying the Chinese Northeast. There was really this fear of a two-front war, that the Germans might attack in Europe and the Japanese might attack on its Asiatic borders. And this led really to an investment into military infrastructure, into sending troops to that region. And this in turn helped to actually establish border control. So this was the first time the government was willing to spend so much money. I mean, we're talking about several thousand miles of sparsely inhabited territory. It takes, I mean, we all know now the US-Mexican border and how hard this is to patrol, even with modern technical equipment. You need a lot of money and you need a lot of resources to do that. And this was the first time actually that the Soviet Union really put an effort in staffing this border efficiently to control it. And this in turn had an impact on the networks across the border. And of course, the Japanese side would again employ those Russian emigres, the white Russians, so to speak, as their own kind of. They were enlisted in their army. They were sent as spies there. So there was really this Russian rivalry in this Soviet Manchukuo or Soviet Japanese rivalry as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm going to try and curate a little bit because we have some questions I think that link up directly to sort of this more sort of international history and sort of power politics and so on. So Professor Lyle Goldstein has a follow-up question that I think is again about sort of international relations. So I'll jump to that and then come back to an earlier question. So Professor Goldstein says, who's at the Naval War College, he says, you have a very unique perspective on the Sino-Soviet conflict. And I found your anecdote regarding railway workers from the early 1970s really fascinating and insightful. In general, what is your opinion on the primary cause of the Sino-Soviet conflict? And in your opinion, does the legacy of the conflict or the split weigh heavily on the relationship today?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an excellent question again. I mean, if you talk about the Zhenbao or Damansky incident in March 1969, I think I didn't do any research on that, but I think it's agreed upon among Russian, Chinese, and Western historians that it was China attacking the Soviet Union in that case. I mean, we could go into details here why that was, but let's put this aside. But I mean, I would say the legacy. Talking about the legacy, it's very interesting. I mean, we had recently the anniversary in 2019, 50 years of a Zhenbao or Damansky incident. And it was very different from the 40th anniversary, 2009. In 2009, it would be still publicly commemorated in the Russian Federation, you know, with reports in the press, with museums preparing special exhibitions, TV doing special reports on that. But it was really muted this time. So it was really, I don't know whether it was an official directive coming from somewhere, but it was really the goal to you could really see the message that we don't want to commemorate this incident because it could complicate the relations. If you talk about locals or speak to locals, obviously they remember that very strongly. You will have lots of jokes, Soviet jokes still running through Russian cities about a Chinese invasion that are related to that incident and to earlier times when several 100,000 Chinese lived in the Russian Far East until the mid-1920s. So this is still there, but not on the official political discourse, so to speak, on this level. Yeah.
Great, thank you. The next question we have is from Leo Chunhao, who says, from the University of Chicago, who says, first of all, thank you for your speech on the Sino-Russian border. I wonder what the purpose of the railroad was in shaping the life experience of the border residents on both sides, and the recognition of Soviet and ROC on the border definition in the 1930s. So as I guess the Nanjing government is formed.
Yes, well, what really I mean, I talked a bit about infrastructure and how the infrastructure changed the nature of the border. In a way, this railroad made this border much more accessible for the political centers, in the sense that you could travel there easily, you could erect customs posts, but you also could channel the transport of people and commodities more easily. And by the channeling, also controlling it better. I mean, if you think about customs and quarantine. But at the same time, this railroad also brought in many new people that I would argue the governments on both sides didn't like very much coming in. Like a lot of migrant workers, trappers, like hunters. There was this Siberian Marmot. It's an animal which sells which skin sells expensively or sold expensively in the world market, and it was hunted down by local people before that. But it really, with the opening of this railroad, it became a world market commodity. It was sold in Leipzig and Paris for fashion. But this again, in turn, created all kinds of problems. There was this great Manchurian plague in 1910, 1911. There always had been cases of plague every year in some villages, but it never spread. I mean, talking about COVID, it never spread so fast and had so devastating consequences. And it was precisely this floating population from both sides that was carrying this disease all along the railroad, and causing most deaths actually in Harbin. I think in Harbin alone, more than 20,000 people died during that winter, and in total 60,000 people. So yeah, it created things that the government who decided to build that railroad by building it, basically. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Sort of shifting focus in some ways to the creation of Mongolia and the place of Mongolia in this history itself. There's an anonymous attendee who's asked, did the independence of Mongolia in the 1920s change the dynamics of the Sino-Russian border in the Manjuli region? So exactly narrowly where you're working with this.
Yes, that's a great question. And I would say yes, definitely, because before that, as I said, it was like mostly an open border, and there was a huge market or fair every fall near a monastery on present day the Chinese side, where herders from all three different states as they exist today, that is Mongolia, China, and Russia, would come and exchange or sell their horses, their cattle, livestock, and buy all kinds of produced fabricated items from the Russians and the Chinese. And with Mongolia becoming an independent and then state, and then as the Soviet satellite, there was also a border created between outer Mongolia and China, and this interaction kind of didn't stop immediately, but decreased over time. And again, for doing, as I mentioned, many Cossacks emigrated to China, but also many nomadic people from the Russian Empire who lived in that region emigrated to China. But often they emigrated actually to outer Mongolia first and then to China. And this became no longer possible at some point in time. So it had a huge impact on the economy and also on people's lives in that region.
Okay, great. I think we have one other it's a comment again from someone who asked a question earlier, Tsungyuan, who has a comment/question that ties into sort of more contemporary politics. So I'll just read it out very quickly. And then maybe that'll be, we're approaching 5:15, so maybe this can be the last question, unless maybe I'll invite, if there's anyone who wants to ask the final question, then they're more than welcome to type it up. Otherwise, we'll consider this to be the final point, sort of dragging you back into contemporary politics, as it were. So the question is, there have been prolonged and massive demonstrations in Khabarovsk over the imprisonment of the governor by Putin's government. To what extent is the fact that the governor belonged to Zhirinovsky's ultra-nationalist party that has made sort of anti-Chinese nest as a central platform, I guess. How is that linked to perhaps increasing Chinese economic dominance in the region? So how do sort of regional and then central politics play into this, and connect with sort of China's growing dominance economically? Do you have any thoughts?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I'm obviously aware of those protests in Khabarovsk and through friends and also obviously through the media, but I've never seen them as anti-Chinese protests. And you're right that the LDPR, the Liberal Democratic Party of the Russian Federation, as it's called, Zhirinovsky's party, is an ultra-nationalist party. But I think the reason why they decided to elect this person was more about not electing United Russia or Единая Россия. Often it's you either choose the communists or the nationalists as an alternative to Putin's official government party. So I wouldn't say, even if he got elected by a majority of voters, that these people are necessarily more nationalistic than they are in other regions of the Russian Federation. It's more about local politics. And I mean, there is anti-Chinese sentiment, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's stronger in Khabarovsk, especially because Khabarovsk, as compared to other cities along the border, especially Blagoveshchensk, which is another big city right at the border, is much less exposed to Chinese, like as workers, as tourists, as entrepreneurs, because there is simply no city across on the Chinese side, and for long there was no border crossing. I mean, there's now a possibility to cross the border, but it's not like in Blagoveshchensk, where you have basically two cities of the same size and people going back and forth very often. It's actually much less, Chinese are much less visible in Khabarovsk, for instance.
Great. So we've received two more questions. I guess what we can do is we can take them. I'll just read them out together so you can answer them together, and then we can wrap up over the next 4 or 5 minutes. So the first question is from Sergei Ivanov at the Vladivostok Institute of History, who asks, Sören, historically, Russia borders countries that vary significantly in terms of culture and economy. Since Russian governance is very centralized, did you explore how Russian and earlier Soviet governments tried to localize unified rules to control cross-border activity with China? For example, as I know, in the last 20 years, Russian customs uses European prices to detect if the transported commodity is underpriced. This practice invoked a lot of court cases between traders and Siberian Far Eastern customs officers, as the commodity prices of Chinese products are lower than European prices. So it's a fairly technical question, but
yeah. Hi, Sergei. Thanks for the question. Actually, I have no answer to that. I must pass. Honestly, I'm not so much concerned with the contemporary period, and I would have to make wild guesses, which I don't want to.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so then the last question, I think it's from the same anonymous questioner who's following up on their question about Mongolia. So we'll conclude with that. They ask, on a macro scale, did the creation of Soviet satellite states like Mongolia for a while and Tannu-Tuva, and hence the shortening of the direct Russia-China border length, I guess, because you have a third country now in the middle, did that impact or complicate a broader Russia-China approaches to the border?
I would say it makes actually things quite much easier, because there's now less possibility for conflict, or less. I mean, Mongolia is kind of stuck in the middle. Tannu-Tuva is now part of this of Russia, obviously, but it's more like, I would say, Mongolia is in this unfortunate role of being a double buffer state between China and between the Russian Federation. And obviously, politically and economically, fortunes have shifted. I think until the 1990s, early 1990s, 80% of foreign trade was with the Soviet Union, and now it's, I think, 90% is going to China. So it's a very different story today. but precisely because there is something, a third country in the middle that kind of helps to ease tensions. And I would actually say there is an attempt on both sides of the border, that is by both governments, that is by Putin and Xi Jinping, to kind of diminish the role of the border regions in their bilateral affairs, since they kind of create more possibility for conflict than for kind of for harmony. I mean, and there, at least at the moment in time, I mean, there's, as we all know, there's a lot of overlap economically speaking, politically speaking, geopolitically speaking, in both countries, and they don't want to see let those regions play a too heavy role in their bilateral relations. And if you look at numbers, at the sheer numbers of the economic significance of these regions, I would argue that until the early 20th century, the border regions, and by those I mean the provinces directly on the border, took the lion's share in economic significance of their bilateral trade balance. But now it's not the case anymore. So it's more between regions lying further inland, that is oil being rigged in other provinces of the Russian Federation, or things being produced not necessarily in Heilongjiang province, but let's say in Jilin province, or in Liaoning, or in Shandong. So it's more significant. Obviously, these direct provinces have more interaction, and as compared to other provinces, maybe also more turnover, but it's not this significant role anymore as they did play in the past.
Thank you. It's interesting that listening to you talk, it's sort of, there's an interesting parallel perhaps that can be explored potentially productively about sort of Nepal's position between China and India, and ways in which it has promoted at times bilateral relations. And these days, it's quite the opposite. It's increased tensions, and Nepal is stuck, but it's also doing, I think, a fairly aggressive job of playing one side or the other. So I think there's an interesting sort of parallel there in terms of a buffer state that then gets caught between two much larger.
Well, yeah, but like Mongolia tried a long time to actually bring in third countries. I think Japan is still until today the biggest donor of aid, development policy. Then you have the Canadians in the mining. The Americans have also like a strategic interest in that region, but that didn't really work out. I mean, they tried it kind of to neutralize, in a way to neutralize China and Russia, to bring in third countries, but it's, I would say it's still it's very much dominated by Russia and China there at their present day situation.
Well, yeah, no, so thank you so much. I mean, right. As you can see, I mean, you had so many questions. This talk was both fantastic and so generative of questions that take us in so many different directions. So thank you again, and on behalf of all the people attending, thank you from them, and thank you to all of them for joining us. I hope you'll join us again in 3 weeks when we host Gina and Tam. I think I'm now blanking on the date, but it's 3 weeks from now. And once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the great questions.
Yeah, thank you.